mic on where you can speak. Yeah, you're all just out of sorts because there's stuff in them. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Samira. Good to be with you.
Let's start with what brought you to human rights work in the first place. What is it that made you want to go into this field?
So, the single biggest factor is that I'm a son of a refugee from Uganda. So, growing up, my father told us about his experiences during the Idi Amin regime. And him fleeing from Uganda, or being expelled from Uganda, I should say. And so he would tell stories about growing up on a street called Nakasero Street, where the most notorious prison in the city of Kampala was housed. And he could hear the screams at night from his bedroom, seeing people huddled and secreted away into military vehicles, never to be heard from again, or soldiers going up to dormitories looking for certain last names that were associated with certain ethnicities, and their forced disappearances, the murders, the bodies that were so voluminous that they would clog up the rivers in Kampala. And my father to this day still suffers from night terrors as a result of his experiences for as long as I've known him. And that was an indelible experience that's burned into my brain and always has been. The idea of a refugee never feeling settled, the idea that no matter how well you do in society, that the political forces can change and everything can be taken from you. So this idea of being on the run, which was really powerful in my psyche, that's where it starts. I think that journey then continues in grad school. So when I was a master's student, having explored, and my master's thesis focused on Palestine. But that education, having a background in international human rights law, meant that you imbibed a lot in human rights atrocities across the globe. But looking at that critically was always to consider the role of my country or the role of the West in these atrocities. It was to look at it critically. It wasn't to look at it...
By your country, you mean Canada?
That's right. It wasn't to look at it with some distance of this is something alien that's happening over there, which is natural and normalized. It was to critically look at our role, and by the our again, Canadians, people in the West, in the Anglosphere. So I wrote a dissertation that looked at the international law of self-determination and where international institutions, for example, the UN, the International Court of Justice, the most powerful members of these institutions, when they fail to secure rights, what happens? Like, is that the end? And I looked at South Africa during apartheid and compared that to Palestine. Because in my mind, these are two places where institutions were paralyzed. So they would say, yes, this group of people has the right to self-determination. They have human rights. There really isn't much we can do about it because we're not prepared to do any more than to pay lip service about it. So these institutions would freeze. And I thought, well, okay, so how did this play out in South Africa? Like, where institutions drop the ball, is there any hope for civil society, for individuals who often don't see themselves as actors in history? They see themselves as observers of history. But is there something that, for those of us concerned about human rights, what can we do? Does South Africa provide a helpful illustration of we can pick up the ball where these institutions drop it? And so I coined a term in that dissertation, which was eventually published, called, excuse me, populist legal movements.
Populist legal movements.
Correct, PLMs. And this is before populism started to be associated with Trump or
Right.
Orban or some of these nefarious...
With a sort of nefarious nationalism.
You got it.
Yeah.
And so it was more, the way that I defined it was a sense of something that was stripped of elites, of institutions, of the powerful, and where its people take it back. And it was really interesting how this worked in South Africa. So, for example, the boycott movement in South Africa was having conferences in London in the late 60s. And some of the leaders of that in England would be people like Rosalind Higgins, who would one day become a judge on the International Court of Justice. He's very active in presenting a legal argument for the boycott movement. And so that's the L part of that, the PLM.
Legal part.
Right.
Yeah.
Where can we harness a legal language? Because for all the things that people might talk about in terms of what the law is, it is also a form of discourse. It's a form of argument, stripped away from the institutions that enforce it and things like that. So I was concerned about, okay, what does this mean for Palestine and other areas where institutions have failed to secure the rights of people that they say that they have, but aren't really prepared to do much more about it. And then again, enrolling as a PhD student, I went further, and my work explored international humanitarian law, and it looked at state violence. And it used as a vehicle this concept of terrorism, right, which isn't defined in international law. It's defined in domestic law in various places. So international law was more concerned with suppressing certain actions. So for example, hijacking airplanes.
Yes.
For the most part, it doesn't provide you with an international legal definition of what it is. So I looked at that and...
Well, was it Reagan who said one person's terrorism is another person's freedom fighter?
Yeah, and I'm sure others have also said it. And of course, the term first, sort of enters consciousness during the French Revolution.
Well, you're giving me a very academic viewpoint of all this. I'm
Right.
hearing a lot of academics speak. I really want to know, though, because for a lot of people, we see these similarities between South Africa and Palestine. We see the sterile roads. We know there's a two-tier system. Palestinians are under military rule. They're not in the civil, legal system. We know there's different colored license plates. All the markers are there.
Yeah.
But for so many people, it's not black and white. And I use that pun on purpose.
Yeah.
Right? And when you mix in the history of how Israel was constructed on the ashes of the Holocaust and all this stuff, it gets really complicated and complex for a lot of people. So I want to leave all of that. I want to leave all of that. I understand where your commitment to human rights comes from, how it sort of sets you on this trajectory academically. You go on to be Assistant Regional Director of the Alberta Human Rights Commission, Executive Director of the Yukon Human Rights Commission. These are big positions. Not rinky-dinky here.
Sure.
Okay. What are your thoughts when you first heard that you're being considered for Chief Commissioner of the Canadian Human Rights Commission?
When I heard I was first being considered, and I was invited to apply, I thought, okay, there's no way. And wasn't interested, like I saw that the position, like I knew the incumbent who was set to retire at a certain point in time, who was about to, and I thought to myself, no, there's no way. And then
why did you think this isn't, there's no way?
I think that's just probably a little bit of, well, probably two things, right? So one is the idea of everybody has a little bit of imposter syndrome, right? And that probably factored into it. But something else also factors into it, which is when you come from a background like mine, part of you, and you don't want to believe it to be true, But, and this comes out later when I was described as the first, POC, the first person of color, the first Muslim. And I'm aware of that in terms of knowing who had led these organizations in the past, not just that one, but other public bodies. And you, as much as you try and dismiss it, you think, no, they're not interested in, bringing on board someone from this background. And with a name that's hard to pronounce, and maybe a bit younger than people that have historically held these positions, like 65-year-old straight white men, right? There seems to be a factory that produces these people to assume leadership positions and nothing else. So the idea that I was being considered, was, okay, well, this is, subjectively, this is surprising.
And it's a very rigorous, process from what I hear. 2 years.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. And so you get let's get to the position. You get the position.
Yeah.
The government makes this big announcement, press release, June 14th, 2024. I want to read out how they describe you. He brings a wealth of both professional and personal lived experience to this role. Our government remains committed to the protection of all human rights in Canada, including the fight against racism, and to strengthening our country's role within the international human rights system. Signed, RF Varani. What are you feeling at this point as this release comes out? You've gotten this position. You must have been on cloud nine.
No, actually. No. I think, and it's interesting, I remember that weekend, and it coincided, that weekend happened to be my birthday. So I had a friend who had come to Toronto.
Gemini.
There you go. Yeah, the whole duality thing. But, so I've heard, and this friend was wondering, why are you not excited about this? And this had occurred to me 2 or 3 days later. So that thing I described in Alberta, which would have occurred to me instantly, and I knew that I was going to assume the role before that public announcement, right? Of course, they had told me a couple of weeks before. And so, there was some excitement, for the first few days. I put it out of my head after that. It's just a thing that's going to happen now, with the public announcement. And again, just living the last 17 months, we know how much polarization and vitriol, especially around identities and things like that. And so at some point during this weekend, after the public announcement, this friend of mine says, you seem distant, like you're not here. What's going on? And, so my father sent me a happy birthday message, but then he also expressed how proud he was. And a few family members did the same thing. They thought of it as a big deal. And I was asked, is this more like a childhood trauma? Like, did your parents not tell you they loved you enough? And again, coming from a South Asian background, it's
you got 98. Why didn't you get 100?
Right, exactly. How come you're not a doctor, right? Like it's all that. So is this a childhood trauma thing? And I said, no, it's not that. I can't quite put my finger on it, and I didn't want to speak it out loud. But I thought, okay, my identity, and I thought more, okay, there's just going to be crazy people on Twitter,
right?
Because this was tweeted, so I thought, okay, Twitter trolls. I wasn't necessarily thinking anything more organized than that. But I'm thinking, I'm going to read a lot of unpleasantness. And this has happened everywhere. Like when I was appointed executive director of the Yukon Human Rights Commission, my predecessor said, we're going to do a press release. And I'm like, okay, do we have to? Right? Yeah. Because the first thing that happens, and of course, I end up reading the comments section. And they were shocked. They're like, don't read the comments section. This is really gross. And I'm like, well, I'm used to it. People are going to be like, what kind of name is that? Oh, is he Muslim? Oh, we need to deport that, right? Like it floods the comment section. And again, you haven't done anything, right? Like all they've done is they've announced you're taking the role, similar to that message, has experience, great. Unfortunately, it's the sort of world that we live in. So that's kind of what I was nervous about. I figured it's going to be like that Yukon experience. And I explained.
It was almost an anticipatory
Yeah.
Anxiety there.
Right. But now on a bigger scale.
Yeah.
Right. And it was more, Twitter trolls. And, I don't like the limelight. I don't like attention. I didn't get much of it. And even with this role, I mean, speaking to a law professor who specialized in human rights law, he said, I've been studying this for 20 years. I can't name a previous chief commissioner. Right? Like it's not, I mean, on the one hand, like the media will call it, this important position, this prestigious position. It doesn't get a lot of press, right? In that sense. And so.
Well, I can tell you that I've spoken to people about you. No one had ever heard your name.
Yeah.
They didn't know. Yeah. So it's June 14th, and then on the 24th, the attacks start. And I went back and looked.
Yeah.
It seemed quite coordinated in the frequency, the vitriol.
Yeah.
What's going through your mind as you start reading these?
So, and I knew a little bit earlier because, of course, the National Post had emailed me on June the 19th. So I think at that point, I'm like, okay, it begins, right? Here we go. So any notion that this would have been, a pain-free process to August 8th, I now know that that's not going to be the case. But I thought of some of the questions. I thought, okay, this is just silly. It's the National Post. Who cares, right? I mean, if I was the sort of person that the National Post spoke highly of or thought highly of, I'd have a problem with myself, right? I mean, so I really didn't care. The National Post is not a place you go to, to actually be informed of anything. But I think, when that started, I think really, and what I was being told was, okay, this will happen now, not a big deal, right? 2 weeks,
It'll pass.
Right? This happens to people that occupy public office, right? And there's a certain group of people, that are political junkies to whom this appeals, right? So if the ethics commissioner does something or says something, in a town like Ottawa, there will be a group of people interested in it, right? But the rest of the world doesn't care. And so it's like, okay, ride this out for 2 weeks, welcome to the national stage, whatever, right? And again, it's the National Post.
I just want to read one of these posts. This is from a person that you are suing for defamation. This is Melissa Landsman, co-deputy leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, official opposition. And she posted this on X. Another anti-Semite gets promoted by Trudeau. Birju Dattani, known for perpetuating hate toward Jews, has been appointed chief of the Canadian Human Rights Commission. This is an elected official accusing you of being an anti-Semite, a proponent of terrorism. What's going through your mind?
Well, I think at that time, I didn't read, that post you read, Melissa Landsman, if I'm being frank. Yeah.
How did you come to know that this was happening online? Apart from just the National Post, getting in touch with you.
So by this point, the National Post, the Globe and Mail, other media outlets were reaching out to me. So I had some sense of where they were going. I think the thing I wasn't seeing, or wasn't looking at, were what the politicians were saying, whether it was Melissa Landsman or Marco Mendicino or David Lametti. At that moment, I'm putting myself in a media blackout. Because you start reading these things, and they're upsetting, and that makes it harder to stay calm at a time when you may need it, right? So now I'm under a microscope. I need to be calm in a crisis. And so the best thing at the time was not to be looking at this stuff and then getting in your head about it. A lot of these things I didn't see till August, right? That's where I start. very gingerly combing through some of these, right? And there's a certain morbid curiosity about it where I'm like, okay, let's actually see what gems of wisdom they had to offer.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I started coming across these things for the first time.
It's not just Landsman,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're going up against some really big organizations in this country, the Center for Israeli Jewish Affairs,
Mm-hmm.
CIJA, B'nai B'rith, one of the oldest Jewish organizations that purports to speak on behalf of all Jews.
Mm.
You're going up against some organizations that really have the ear of lawmakers
Mm-hmm.
in this country, and a lot of our lawmakers get paid by these organizations.
Yeah.
And then you have these self-diagnosed Toronto-based media influencer Dalia Kurtz, Ezra Levant, who runs Rebel News. And you're laughing, but they do have some influence, unfortunately.
Sure.
And the government did react to these allegations, right? They launched this third-party led fact-finding mission,
right,
which ultimately concluded, and this is the point that I really want to come to, that it could find no evidence of anti-Semitism or demonstrated bias against Jews or Israelis.
Yeah.
So does that make the accusation stop?
No, it doesn't. I mean, because and the reason it doesn't, and I've thought about this often. There's a difference between, let's take an anodyne fact, right? So let's pick today's date, which is, and I never know what day it is, but what's the date today? It's
March 26th.
Yeah, Wednesday, right? Wednesday, March 26th. So if I had said, Samira, Wednesday, March 25th, and you told me, look, Birju, it's actually the 26th. You mean the 26th. I would say, yeah, sorry, that's what I meant. I don't need it to be the 25th today. I don't need that to be true. If I responded and I said, well, look, Samira, I mean, in Japan, like it might, there's a different calendar and they actually, so I'm not really wrong. I was actually right when I said the 25th. If I need it to be true, and this is sort of like an interesting thing, when people need things to be true, independent from whether or not they are true, this is where, I mean, it is probably a start to a definition of what an ideologue is, right? So I need something to be true. I need, for example, in a more geopolitical sense, most moral army, right? So if I said most moral army, which country are you thinking of? Where have you heard that before?
Israel.
Okay, there are people that need that to be true. So whether it is true, so if we're providing facts that maybe undermine that, most people that don't have an ideological commitment to this will look at that the way that they look at most facts, right? True. But the point being that if you're ideologically committed to a position, then again, you can't accept facts, right? So there, it doesn't matter what Human Rights Watch says or what Amnesty International says or what the International Court of Justice says or what the International Criminal Court says or what Oxfam says or what the World Food Program says. Because you have a measuring stick by which you're measuring something, and if the thing doesn't measure up, ideologues will throw out the measuring stick, right?
And that's the crux of your case, right? The crux of your case is that the third-party investigation was done. There were not even an inkling of anti-Semitism or bias against Jews, against Israelis, etc. found, yet these accusations persisted.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
And so that is really the crux of your case.
Right.
But if we move beyond your case,
yep,
we're living in a time where anyone speaking out on Israel's genocide is being reprimanded, risking their livelihoods, education, grants, etc. You name it. We've all seen people being stripped of it.
Yep.
What are your thoughts? I mean, you're first and foremost a human rights lawyer. I know that you've become the center of this case. But when you look at this level of persecution, and in some cases, prosecution, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are, and I'll probably offer two. The first is, at least for me, I found this dislocating, right? Where I'm watching this unfold, and Mark Haven had an interesting article about how, which was titled, "Who Can Be Anti-Semitic?" Well, anybody, but mostly the racialized. And this has had, and as you know, racialized journalists, healthcare workers, educators, lawyers. You can run the list of every profession, any type of employment, any type of
cooks, even I know
cooks, yep, service relationship, you name it. And it's immensely dislocating, because it sort of demonstrates that people that have a skin tone like mine, or like maybe like yours, our lives don't matter. They don't, right? I mean, in the scheme of things, there's a certain amount of privilege that a system will let you have, right? And I was reminded of reading a case during the Chinese Exclusion Act, so 100 years ago. And in Vancouver, there is someone, Southeast Asian fellow, Chinese fellow, who is attacked by, this group of people. They're all white, and he fights back, self-defense. One of them happened to be a police officer, right? Wasn't on duty at the time. And so a lot of commentary on that was he was guilty of being a Chinese person that assaulted a white person, right? So he violated this rule of knowing your place, and his place in that society was non-existence, right? As Omar al-Akkad might put it, right? So he violated that rule of non-existence. During this assault, they kind of knew who he was, right? So a lot of these people who are racialized, right, they're violating that rule here as well.
Do you put yourself in that line? Do you put yourself in that through line of historically the people who didn't know their place and are now?
Yeah. Well, that's a thought I have, right? Is that I'm not allowed to speak this way, right?
If not you, who though? See,
right.
That's the thing when I was looking at your case. Master's SOAS, PhD, Alberta Regional Director, Yukon Human Rights Commission. If it's not you, then who can speak? That is very dangerous. Right?
Yeah.
It's very dangerous to think that it doesn't matter how many degrees or how learned we are. We're not allowed to say the thing is the thing.
Well, and there's a certain distance here that the system puts between most people and someone like me, Muslim identity, brown guy, a name that you're going to butcher over and over again until I tell you, how it's pronounced phonetically. This didn't really have much to do with anything that I did. And one of the things I reflected on is, I kept thinking what was frustrating is I'm thinking, they'll say he shared a panel with this guy. He shared a panel with Ben White. Here's what Ben White thinks. I'm like, cool. Ben White thinks that. What do I think? Like, what are you objecting to that I've said? Or he shared a panel with Moazzam Begg, who was in Guantanamo Bay, right? He was a Guantanamo Bay detainee, was tortured in Guantanamo Bay. I'm like, cool. Not a fan of torture, but how come you're like omitting that the guy sitting next to me was from Breitbart News? And why don't you think that I could hold his views instead of the other Muslim guy on the panel? Oh, it's because we're both brown, right? So it's more, what in your imagination is this guy, right, who's Muslim, who's brown, whose name you can't pronounce? What is he actually capable of? Forget what he did, right? It's enough to think that, writing something in a dissertation about terrorism, right? The Globe and Mail headline, new human rights chief once made academic argument. I'm thinking, okay, whatever follows is going to be absolutely hilarious now, right? That terrorism can be a rational strategy. At that point, there was almost 12 academics in this country who I'd never met who called out the Globe and Mail, saying this isn't controversial in this area. Maybe try talking to an expert rather than asking, groups like Seizure, Friends of Simon Wiesenthal, their view on something that ostensibly they don't have any expertise in,
Mhm.
right? But the idea that was being manufactured in the media is, but wait, what is he capable of? It doesn't matter what he did,
Mhm.
right? So go back to 2006 for a minute, and because this isn't small potatoes, right? Let's look at Mahurar, right?
Yes.
2006, right? The O'Connor Report is published, right? 3 volumes on Ontario Court of Appeal justice. He was scathing about the media's complicity in having this guy detained for 2 years when the commissioner tortured. Yes, thank you. When the commissioner of the RCMP, who admitted that within days he knew that the guy was innocent, right? And some of these, journalists who are still journalists in prominent positions who had a role to play and who were called out, if that were me, I'd be embarrassed to show my face. And these people are celebrated.
Well, they just say they're doing their job.
Right, yeah. And
right, my editor told me, I made a phone call,
right.
This is what was happening,
right.
That's sort of
just following orders, yeah.
I want to stick to the media. You brought up the media.
Right.
I went back and I was looking at all the media clippings about your resignation and then the entire story, the accusations. And the only thing that was missing from the media was the part where the investigation found no wrongdoing on your part.
That's right.
What impact do you think the media had on promulgating these accusations against you?
In my view, they had the most central role. And in some ways, I never really had high expectations of, the legacy media in this country. I would tell my father, right? He's part of a generation where the news is always on, right? And I said, look, if you're watching CTV, CBC, Global, because you're expecting them to tell you what's happening in the world, or you want them to feed you the analysis of something, can I swear?
Yes, of course. Nobody funds us.
All right, great. So if you're fucked, right? Don't bother, right? That was always my view. I didn't have a ton of respect, right, for the legacy media, but this was just, you're going out of your way. This was like this is the unmaking of language. This is the unmaking of narrative, right? The media would have known, right, or ought to have, right? Like, what's the expression? If you're a journalist and someone tells you it's raining and someone else doesn't, your job isn't to say, hey, this person says it's raining, this person doesn't.
And leave it there.
Right. Like, look out the fucking window, right? Like, do some confirmation, right? Like, the media was going, in my view, out of their way, right? Or that terrorism angle where at least 2 academics, one in journalism, one in security studies, said, hey, Globe and Mail, this is a bad faith smear job. This looks like a hit job. Next time, talk to someone who's an expert in security studies or terrorism or anything else. Like, you're going out of your way to manufacture a narrative that I suspect is not true, because you're bumping up against facts that, if you're doing your job, you ought to present.
9 months has passed. You finally decided, you know what? I'm going to go after these people who tarnished my image.
Yeah.
What finally made you want to do that?
Couple of things. First of all, I've been watching, like everybody else, what's been happening for 17 or 18 months. I haven't publicly said anything on Gaza. And watching that unfold, like a lot of people, I had trouble sleeping every night. I don't think I slept more than 6 hours. And you're walking this tightrope. You're being careful about what you say. And when you come from certain backgrounds, even to express compassion, about the images of children. I have a 6-year-old nephew who I was something, the day he was born, I was something of like a surrogate parent, and my sister and I are very close. I've fed him, I've changed his diapers, I've bathed him, I put him to sleep. And those kids look like him. It shouldn't be a surprise that brown people have sympathy when other brown people are dying. We also have sympathy when white people die. I mean, this isn't, it's again, that thing that I said about distance a moment ago. We don't really have that distance. I was mortified about the plight of Israeli hostages. I was, grossed out, and beyond words when Mila Cohen, the 10-month-old baby, was killed on October 7th. The Bibas family was heart-wrenching. And we know the names of Israeli hostages. I mean, I can state that back to you. I don't know if some of the people that are making the accusations against me would be able to share you the names of, someone who is an administrative detainee, in Israel, or someone who was, sexually assaulted or raped in Sidi Taman prison under the most horrific circumstances.
Or the names of any of the 15,000 children killed.
Right. Yeah. Just one. Right. But, I didn't talk about that stuff. And in the meantime, I'm seeing, this person is fired. This person is driven out of their jobs. What I was really seeing is accusation is made against a person. That is then investigated. It is then found that that person didn't violate a policy, a harassment or discrimination policy. That person isn't an anti-Semite within, any sort of, a definition of that. And nevertheless, I mean, this happens so frequently that I'm tired of this.
It seems like the accusation is enough, though.
No, and the accusation, and that's just it.
Because I was speaking with your lawyer prior to, and she was speaking to me about the weaponization of anti-Semitism that we've seen over the past 17 months, right? UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, anti-Semitic, Oxfam, anti-Semitic.
Let me give you two more if I can quickly.
Yeah.
So take, and this is recent, but it's coming back like a bad penny. Derek Penzlar, right? The William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish Studies at Harvard University, the director of the Center of Jewish Studies at Harvard University, a guy who's from Toronto, right? Formerly at the University of Toronto, brilliant scholar, by the way, who was named the co-chair of Harvard's Task Force on Antisemitism after Claudine Gay resigned.
Yes.
He was called 2 days ago, yet again, an anti-Semite. In fact, in the month of March, he's been called an anti-Semite for two different things. One of them was hosting a panel on Lebanon, right, of Israel's war in Lebanon. Another was, the most recent one was he advertised a course called 1,000 Years of Palestine on the Center for Jewish Studies' website, of which he is the director. The American Academy of Jewish Research has said no one has done more to combat anti-Semitism and to, as a scholar of Zionism, as a scholar of Jewish studies, he is unrivaled.
But do you find solace in that? Do you think to yourself, you know what, I'm in good company? And just to know that sort of, I was getting to this, that, the UN Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, has also been called anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
Oxfam is now anti-Semitic.
Doctors Without Borders.
Save the Children, Human Rights Watch, yours truly.
Yeah.
Does this list of people and organizations provide you with any solace? Or any comfort?
Well, I mean, I think the way I look at it, like what concerns me is that this is going to, my fear is that it undermines the fight against anti-Semitism. Right? I actually feel more fearful than I think I feel solace. Is anti-Semitism is a problem, right? And I don't think it's reasonable for, I don't think you're going to find reasonable people that are going to disagree. I'm worried about what this means, in the end for Jewish people, right?
About the hollowing out of the term, you mean?
Yeah, I'm sure. Like, look, we need to reflexively defend Israel at any and all costs. Like, we need to do this thing where we're conflating the two things, and it doesn't matter. They're not thinking 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road, right? And that worries me.
Last question.
Yeah.
Again, I want to go beyond your case, because you've mentioned
please.
this before and said that you're doing this not just for yourself, but for other people.
Yeah.
What is it that is really moving you to do this beyond yourself? What are you hoping will come out of this?
I know. Firstly, and I think we both do, but so many people, this has happened to so many people whose stories will never be in the public eye, right? Who are going to have to suffer in silence and be tarred with this, who don't have the resources, to take this to court. Also, there needs to be a cost imposed on these sorts of strategies, right? There does, right? Like, this is happening so often, so frequently, in such bad faith that it's targeting too many people, right? This is happening too often. Where, okay, yeah, like, this needs to stop, right? Like, it's not just I'm exhausted of this, but I'm exhausted that this is happening to too many people. This isn't a serious conversation anymore. I'm angry about this. And my story is a sliver in this wider narrative, right? And so this needs to stop. It really does. And so if this is the way, if other people get behind, whether they get behind me or they get behind anybody, if people say, you know what, okay, you can't get away with this. Like, you really can't. Impunity does have limits at the end of the day.
Well, I hope the next time we speak and I follow up on this, you will be victorious.
That might be years from now, but hopefully we can talk before then.
Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
Can you take me through, first of all, what is defamation? And then can you take me through the defamatory nature of the allegations made against Mr. Dattani?
Sure. So defamation is any statement that would lower someone's reputation in the eyes of the community. It's very easy to defame someone. Just in normal sort of everyday interaction, we defame people all the time in our normal statements. Just things that we would say. The vast majority of defamation litigation happens in the defenses. And in this case, there really are sort of two main defenses that would be at issue. The first is truth. A statement that is true is a complete defense to a defamation charge. Also, there's opinion. And so you're entitled to have your opinion. You're entitled to say things about someone, but those opinions have to be based in objective truth. In this case, after Mr. Dattani, in this case, we know that there was a public report that was made. And in that report, which was again made public and published, it said that there was no evidence that Mr. Dattani was anti-Semitic or that he harbored terrorist sympathetic views or ideology. After that report was made public, individuals continued to make public statements that said that Mr. Dattani was anti-Semitic and that he was a terrorist sympathizer. Those statements cannot be objectively true in face of this public report that said he is not anti-Semitic and he is not a terrorist sympathizer. But yet these statements continued to be made after the report was issued. And those statements, that's what's defamatory.
And what impact do you think these statements would have on our ability to sort of safeguard human rights advocacy or free speech? What impact is this having?
In general, I believe that when we have statements like that are being made that call someone anti-Semitic, particularly using that phrase anti-Semitic and anti-Semitism, that's a really heavily laden accusation. It's a deeply harmful accusation to make. It's one of the worst things we can say about someone in our current political climate. And calling someone anti-Semitic like that has the real potential to restrict expression. People are going to be afraid to say things. They're going to be afraid that if they express their opinions, and if they express opinions that are against Israel in some way, or against Israeli policies in Gaza in particular, is that going to be seen as being anti-Semitic? Are they going to be labeled as anti-Semitic because they're pro-Palestinian? And those sorts of accusations being made against someone, that really has the potential to restrict expression and to restrict debate. And legally, we call that chill. It's going to chill.
A chilling effect.
Chilling effect,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's going to have a chilling effect on expression. And as someone who strongly advocates for free expression and free speech, that chill, that sort of fear that would come into someone, oh, should I say that? Or is that going to get me in trouble if I say that? That sort of chill is deeply harmful to free expression and free debate.
I want to go a little bit beyond this case in particular, with Birju Dattani's case, because this is something that a lot of people have been facing in the past 17 months, the climate that we're seeing. Artists, caretakers, teachers, professors, everyone feels like they are under threat and they're being watched. And it's created this environment, as you said, it's very precarious.
Yeah.
This case in particular, what sort of precedent might this set for people who want to make such allegations?
I mean, legally, there could be the precedent at the end, in terms of vindicating Mr. Dattani and vindicating the fact, countering this weaponized use of anti-Semitism that has come against him. So vindicating him personally through this litigation. But I know that something else that Mr. Dattani has referenced, and he's talked about this, that he is a prominent figure, he is a prominent person, and he is able to stand up against these allegations that have been made against him, and able to stand up against some pretty powerful organizations and individuals. Not everybody has that ability to commence litigation, to make that statement, to say, what you're saying about me is wrong and you shouldn't be able to say that. So I think in a lot of ways, just being able to stand up and to publicly say what is being said about me is wrong is already very validating for a lot of other people who may not have the power position that Mr. Dattani has. And I know he's spoken about that as well, that he felt really compelled to be able to speak on behalf of others who might not have the ability to speak up. Because as you said, there is a real climate of fear of being able to say that, just again, as I said, saying you're pro-Palestinian, criticizing the Israeli policies in Gaza, that can get you in trouble right now. And there's a fear about saying that. If I can take it to a personal level, I made a post on social media after I had overheard some unfortunate statements about Mr. Dattani, and I made a statement about, I wrote this social media post about how the Islamophobia that was so inherent in the comments that I heard about Mr. Dattani. I was personally shocked at these people who didn't know Mr. Dattani, didn't have any connection to the case, and the just underlying inherent Islamophobia in some of the statements I was hearing. And I made a social media post about it, and I have had people reach out to me privately to say that they thought that post was very brave.
Isn't that interesting?
And I was floored, and I've had people say, so brave. I don't feel like I can call out Islamophobia right now because I'm worried I will be canceled if I say that. That is it sort of shakes me to my core to think that people are scared to call out Islamophobia for fear that that's going to end them being labeled as anti-Semitic. That is so hurtful to our society in so many ways.
It's such a twisted paradigm that's
really
been
is.
set up, isn't it?
Yeah.
That you have to feel brave to do something that is so basic, and that you feel like you're going against the tide by doing that.
Yeah. And as I said, I mean, all that my post was doing was calling out some just inherently racist comment, mispronouncing names, saying that a course clearly couldn't be objective because it was taught by one person who was Muslim. It couldn't possibly be that sort of just basic Islamophobia. And that was all I did in this post. And as I said, the number of people that reached out to me to say it was brave, because that was really shocking to me. I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah, it's a weird feeling too, because I've had it in my own profession where people say, I'm with you, but I have to do it privately, or I don't feel like I can do it, or I'm doing it through you. And in my mind, I'm always like, I don't need that from you. As much as I appreciate the comments, it's a very awful time that we're living in.
Yeah.
What do you hope that will come out of this case beyond sort of, retribution for, not retribution, that's not the right word, compensation, just justice, really,
Justice
for
Birju.
for Mr. Dattani. What else do you hope will come out of it?
I would hope that even just again, the fact that he has taken the step, that people will hopefully think twice about labeling somebody anti-Semitic and weaponizing that term, using that term to harm someone's reputation, when all that Mr. Dattani has done is to be an advocate for human rights and to stand up for equality and equity and diversity, and to try to bring someone down by using the term anti-Semitism. I am hopeful that people will realize the impact of that statement, and that we can get back to a place where we can actually engage with each other and be in a civil debate, and recognize that this isn't a one side or the other type of situation. This post that I wrote, one of the last things that I ended the post with was to say that the freedom of no one is safe unless the freedom of everyone is safe. And this idea that we're sort of these polarized camps is so harmful to just public debate and civil society. Hate in all forms, and that hate in all forms should be addressed. And I know that's something that Mr. Dattani has really worked for throughout his career, is to address inequality and hate against all people. And I'm hopeful that, I would love to see us be able to get back to a place where we realize that it's not really like one side or the other. It's just hate in general and intolerance in general. That's what I'm hoping to see.
I'm wondering if you've received any backlash for taking on this case.
Yes, it had, we expected that. So yes, as I said, I made this post. I have had some people who definitely think that we are on the quote wrong side of this, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much.